Russian President Vladimir Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine enters its 12th week. We are writing day 78 of this war. Fierce battles are continuing in the east and south of Ukraine. Ukrainian fighters in the Azov steelworks at Mariupol are still holding out. The Ukrainian army continues to push Russian troops further away from Kharkiv, while in the occupied Kherson Oblast, preparations are ongoing to declare this oblast Russian territory. Meanwhile, the European Union has been unable to finalize its sixth sanction package because of Hungarian obstructionism. And within the last 24 hours, we saw first moves on the Russian part to engage into sort of countermeasures as far as gas supplies to Europe are concerned. We discussed this at length last time. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz explained his government's policy of supporting Ukraine, including sending heavy weapons, in his speech to mark May the 8th. A visit on his part to Kyiv is still not planned, though. Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock visited the Ukrainian capital on Tuesday and reopened the German embassy there. Most attention, however, has focused on the way the Kremlin has marked the 77th anniversary of the defeat of Nazi Germany on May the 9th. Even though the skies were clear, a flyby of military planes, supposedly in formation of the letter Z, was cancelled because of the weather. In his speech, Russian President Vladimir Putin drew a direct line between the war against Hitler and the one he launched on February the 24th, describing his action as preemptive and defensive, and insisting that Russian soldiers were defending Russian lands. To discuss all this and more, we have three experts with us to assess the situation once more. This time, however, we will slightly depart from our usual sequence. We will start with an assessment of Putin's May the 9th speech and the consequences for Western Russia policy. But to start us off, let's turn to Stefan now.
So talking about Putin's speech on May the 9th, I have to say, for me, it's strange that we first of all discuss what Putin did not say, but not what he said. I think that's very much in the German debate. So what did he not say? But I think he said quite a lot of, even if it was a short speech, a relatively short speech, and there was not this huge issue he might have mentioned. Western debates were so much focused on a possible mobilization in Russia and an announcement of escalation that we were already happy that Putin did neither. I think that's also very typical on how we're reacting to Putin from our side. But I think that's problematic because it distracts from what he was saying, which we should be much more concerned about, in my opinion. Putin's speech, the first part for me is about the messages towards Russian society, and the second part is the messages towards the West. Towards Russian society, I think the messages were, we are fighting like in World War II Nazis in Ukraine, and these Nazis are the proxies of the West, particularly the US. US wanted Ukraine to attack Russia, and we did a preventive attack on Ukraine. So this is a proxy war with the US. Donbas, Crimea are our lands, and an integrative part of Russia. We will free them from Ukrainian Nazis. So he was using this term quite often. Russian state recognizes the Russian victims of the war and will compensate their families. And I think that was really a new element. What are the main conclusions from this on the society? Society should prepare for a longer-term war with more victims, and they will be recognized by the state like the victims of World War II in a way, and will be also the families will be compensated. So war will go on from the Russian side. Repetition of the crude historical perception of Putin. Misuse of the victory of the Soviet Union in World War II against Nazi Germany for this war in Ukraine. Triggering the Russian society in linking German Nazis with Ukrainian Nazis. I think that's a very dangerous perception with all its consequences also in reshaping history. The West is using Ukrainians against Russia, linking the victory in World War II with the fight against the West from the Cold War. These are two trigger topics in the Russian society, victory in World War II and fighting against the West in the Cold War. And here's a kind of the creation of a parallel reality by the regime in the Russian propaganda, in the Russian public sphere. What are the messages towards the West? We will make no millimeter of compromise. At the moment, the main goal is Donbass and parts of southern Ukraine, but that might not end there. Sanctions will have no impact on the Russian calculation because it is a war for an independent and sovereign Russia. I think he also emphasized this. Prepare for a longer war. It confirms that Putin is locked in his own view of history, that he is on a historical mission and is not adapting his mindset to the reality in which Russia cannot win this war. He's refusing that he lost Ukrainian society, particularly including the Russian-speaking part in the east of the country. There's a recognition of Russian victims in this war as an element, as a new element, and it shows that Putin reacts to the concerns and resistance in the society about the costs of the war, especially the dead soldiers. Russia might need at least a partly mobilization to take Donbass completely. Maybe also András can say something on this. That Putin did not announce this mobilization can mean two things, in my opinion. First, the decision would be so unpopular in the Russian society that he is very careful to make this decision. Russian army has a problem to mobilize sufficient soldiers, and we can observe in some smaller cities in Russia a strong resistance against sending more soldiers to Ukraine. It could secondly mean either the Kremlin thinks they can take Donbass without partly mobilization, or they will announce it in the next weeks. So I think that does not mean if it happens now, that it cannot happen in the next 2 or 3 weeks. Only that we expect and widely discuss that it might happen was already a reason not to do it for Putin. At the same time, he can do it any time later. It confirms also that Russian leadership started this war with the perception that they would lose Ukraine because of its modernization of the army and integration with the EU. At the same time, if they would really have the assessment that the modernization of the Ukrainian army with US, NATO support would have been successful, so that the escalation balance would change, they would have started the war differently, in my opinion. Yeah, so if they would really expect that Ukraine is really able to fight and to attack Russia, then they would have started a different war, in my opinion. So I don't see here the logic. And I would repeat my argument: the Russian leadership is a crucial part of the Russian information campaign in this war. I think also Putin has shown this again. On one hand, we should take serious what Putin is saying. On the other hand, he and other government members use the methods of confusion, subversion, and destabilization in what they are saying. When Lavrov is talking about a third world war and indirectly about the possible use of nuclear weapons, this is first of all targeted to our pacifistic society. So this is an information campaign. The regime will carefully write if they use nuclear weapons or not, if they attack a NATO member or not. You cannot exclude that, but it's currently not the goal. Also, Putin is using the methods with his language and lies. He subverts Russian society and our trust in political leaders. We are discussing his speeches and already accepting parts of the narratives he is spreading. He brings disinformation into our discourse through what he and other high-ranking Russian officials are saying. I think that's also very important. At the same time, for me, what US President Biden is saying is also problematic. I would never talk about regime change in Russia because it confirms the threat perception of the Russian leadership. You can think about it, but not say it. That the goal of Biden is a defeat of Russia raises expectations which might not be possible to fulfill. I think that's also problematic. The state of the Ukrainian army is a black box for us. At the same time, we know from history what a defeat can mean. Plus, it closes any options for negotiations with Putin, I think, which is not very smart. And Putin, and this is my final word, with his speech, he confirms that they really create their own reality. So their own history, their own perception, and their own reality. And this is very much targeted on the Russian society. And I think this is really partly successful, that this parallel reality has become their real reality in how to perceive this war.
Very interesting, Stefan. Very much. Thank you very much. Just one quick point on this reality. I mean, Chancellor Merkel, I think in 2015, spoke of Putin living in his own reality. Can we assume that Putin is no longer sharing a sort of a Western view of the situation, or is not even capable of understanding how the West sees the situation? What do you think?
I think he never shared the Western view. So I think he always had a different perception of what the West did. I think what has different already in the last years is that he does not care so much in a way how we react or what we're thinking and saying. So he's just doing things, and there are no red lines. And I think he's really somehow increasingly locked into his own worldview and his historical view. And that's maybe the result of the pandemic, but I think that's also a development of Putin and of his personal isolation. And I think that this is also what Macron confirmed, and others, that they cannot reach out to him. They talk to him, but they talk in really in different realities. And I think that matches not anymore at all. And I think that's really a very dangerous situation, how you want to impact on a leader in terms of getting a ceasefire or a peace agreement when his perception is completely different, and he does not trust at all in your perception, and you do not match. I think that's a very difficult and dangerous situation.
Thank you very much. Let's now turn to Liana for her assessment of the speech and what follows from it.
Stefan has said everything that had to be said about the speech, so perhaps I focus a little bit more on the reaction from the Ukrainian side, but also on our reaction to that speech, and perhaps also a little bit on the US perspective. So Ukraine's reaction, there were two speeches or two videos put out by President Zelensky. One was on May 8, this video in black and white where he was walking with a I'm Ukrainian t-shirt through Ukraine against the backdrop of bombed cities. And that was quite a powerful message that he tried to convey, and which shows us to what extent the narrative and the commemoration of May 8th and 9th is already now and will be in the future contested in the post-Soviet sphere. So what the Ukrainians try is to get back the memory of May 8 and 9 from the Soviet traditions, from this this discourse that the Russian president puts out now, that this is the justification for the war of today, and to pursue their own commemoration of May 8 and 9. And President Zelensky has framed this in his first video as in the context of never again. He argued that this never is not for Ukraine is not the case anymore. So he links it to the experience of genocide, so this experience of the Second World War and the Holocaust. And the other message that he put out on May 9 in response to Putin's speech was very much a message that this is not a fight about two armies, but this is a fight about two worldviews. And he added that Ukraine will see two victory days in the future, May 8, May 9, and Ukraine's victory over Russia. And I think this is an interesting development, that if there's anyone who can shape sort of an alternative commemoration and memoration of May 8 and 9, it is Zelensky, because he's just so talented in putting out narratives, in mobilizing his own society, but also in sending out messages to Western societies. And this is just the beginning of May 8 and 9, on the one hand, by the Russian side being entirely politicized and instrumentalized for the war purposes, and then on the other hand, the other post-Soviet countries trying to get back that memory for their own nation-state building and for their own fight against Russia and distance from Russia. And just to in visual terms, the contours could not have been stronger. Zelensky against the backdrop of the bomb buildings in comparison to Putin's victory parade, that was very strong image, which again sort of underlined the David against Goliath narrative, which works so well also from the Ukrainian side in this conflict, in this war. The other part of this is our reaction to the speech, and Stefan has already said a couple of words about that. The first one is that it is the fact that this was not an escalatory speech for us is already perceived as a cautious speech. And I think we have to be careful how sort of with this narrative and this way of sending messages from the Kremlin, we are sort of changing our own goalpost. So if our reaction to that speech was, well, oh, that's fine, he's obviously not escalating, and some reactions are, so perhaps he has understood that, you know, his mission has gone too far. I think we have to be very careful with this kind of assessments, because in his speech we have seen that his strategic goals for the war have not changed. I mean, the strategic goal remains to have Ukraine under control, under Russian control. The narrative about neo-Nazis continues. So the strategic goal that Ukraine's existence as an independent and sovereign state is not accepted by Moscow remains the same. Just the fact that the tactical goals have changed to the east and to the south, and the fact that the speech was directed towards Russian society, and therefore it was about the Donbass and not about the entirety of Ukraine, should not lead us to feel, oh great, we are not in a phase of escalation anymore, the situation is somehow stabilizing. I think that would be dangerous, and that would be sort of accepting the narrative that he puts out there. The other point is, it was interesting that there were no nuclear threats in his speech, which I would put into the context that I perceive the speech very much as a domestic-oriented speech. But in at least in the German discourse, and to some extent perhaps also the US discourse, the threat of nuclear escalation, at least in the last, let's say, 2 weeks, 2-3 weeks, has become very dominant in our societies as an argument. And this is something that I'm concerned about, that increasingly there was a link between supporting Ukraine and risking nuclear war. And for instance, some articles also in German media presented the way how the war can go as two alternatives that we have, and both are equally bad: supporting Ukraine, risking nuclear war, and then on the other hand, not supporting Ukraine and giving it to Putin. And I think this causal link that is increasingly established in the public perception, that the more gains Ukraine has, the more Ukraine is successful in pushing Russia back, the more dangerous Russia becomes. Putin is put into the corner, and then he will use a nuclear weapon. And I think this is something which can undermine the Ukrainian effort in support of it, especially if Ukraine goes into counteroffensive and tries to regain territory, because this would be perceived as a dangerous or provocative mood. And I think we have to de-link this almost causal relationship that is partly established in the German public now between the nuclear threat and what is actually happening on the ground, and to communicate better that those nuclear threats are, as Stefan said, those are political instruments to coerce us into political concessions. And the risk should never be excluded, but this is something which has to be better communicated in the public. And I do think that to some extent the communication of the Chancellor, who uses this context of nuclear war and Third World War, has used it in the past, also contributes to this perception. The last point that I'd like to make, in addition to what Stefan said, I think I would see the US perspective perhaps a little bit different. I would not see regime change as an aim from a US perspective. I think that's something where the US administration is very careful in not framing it that way. I do see that we have different perspective coming from different corners in Washington. So Austin's quote that Russia should be weakened was actually said in the context of Ukraine. So Russia should be weakened so that it cannot continue what it has done in Ukraine. But obviously the Pentagon has a different mission than the State Department or the White House on this. And so there are different emphasis from the State Department. It's very much about transatlantic solidarity and upholding the international order. The Pentagon obviously sees it now as an opportunity to weaken Russia. And then the White House very clearly supports the aim of pushing Russia back at least to the February 2024 lines. So I don't yet see that this is a position of defeating Russia sort of on the global scale. I do see it as a position of defeating Russia in Ukraine. I don't think that the US goal is to see Russia partitioned, or whatever capitulation scenarios you might think about. I don't think this is perceived as realistic. What is perceived as realistic is to push Russia back from the territories that they have conquered, and to pursue in the long term a policy of containment towards Russia. So I would be less concerned about a dramatic change in US goals in this war, and although this is also to some extent becoming because otherwise it sort of can become in the public discourse also a discourse about, in the end this is all just a proxy war, Ukraine, between the US and Russia, and that's not how I see it. This is not a proxy war. The US didn't want this war, and now that it's there, they're fighting it with immense support for Ukraine, and the news that information US was targeting, was giving intelligence information to the Ukrainians that led to the death of generals, that led to the sinking of the Moskva, is something which led to concern in Washington, how these leaks can be published. So this is not something which was put out there intentionally to show that the US wants to defeat Russia, but which was actually a link within the administration. I think they know very well that they have to be more cautious with these kinds of statements, or to prevent these leaks, because it's just, it doesn't help. I mean, they might provide the intelligence, but some things you should just not talk about it. So that's perhaps from the US perspective.
Sorry, thank you very much, Liana. There's one question by Eileen. My colleague Eileen from DGAP, also from the security program.
Good morning. Thank you very much to both of you for your concise and yet informative remarks. Liana, I would like to go back to something that you just mentioned, possible US goals in the war and beyond, with regard especially to Russia. Could you possibly comment on what, in your view, Germany's goals are in this war, and do they align with US goals, and also maybe in a broader European and transatlantic context? If you could sort of contextualize that, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Let's get Boris Ginsburg also into the discussion. Then our two speakers have a chance to pick up on that. Boris.
Yeah, thank you. Two questions. First of all, I would like to ask your opinion about the fact that recently, I think 5 governors have stepped down in Russia. What do you make out of this? And the second question regarding the speech of Putin, what I found very interesting is the fact that Putin made a reference to the former anti-Hitler coalition partners in his speech. So I would like to ask you what is your impression of this remark? Whether this remark is just empty words, or is there maybe a certain deeper meaning?
Liana, you want to start with Eileen's question?
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, and I'll be quick. German aims. That's a very good question. I do think that there was a difference in the aims, and I think that this idea that Ukraine is fighting for Europe's security and for the security of the transatlantic alliance is an idea which is much more prominent in the United States, which is accepted that this is not only a regional war, but this is a war which really affects our security. And I don't think that this is an argument which is accepted so far in Berlin. I mean, if we look at Scholz's speech on May 8 or May 9, you see that his aim is that Ukraine basically survives. But this link between our strategic interests and Ukraine's fight against Russia is not made publicly, out of concern that this becomes a slippery slope, where at some point, if we say Ukraine fights for our security, we need to fight Russia for our security ourselves. But this is not something which is established. So this is another concern that I have, that as long as you don't sort of establish it as a war that you don't only fight for moral or for altruistic reasons, but for your own security interests, the support is much less sustainable. I mean, from a moral altruistic perspective, you can always say, well, we've done our best, now good luck. If you frame it as a strategic interest from your perspective, then it becomes a more sustainable effort. And that's perhaps where I see the main difference between the US aims, who looks at this war strategically, and Germany's aims, which from my perspective are, don't have the same element of German security and European security and defending this in Ukraine. Thanks so much, everyone. I'll jump off.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Please feel free to disappear sort of whenever it suits you best. Stefan, maybe you can pick up the other 2 points: the resigning governors and also the mention of Soviet allies.
Quick reaction also to the German position and aims. I think because I think that's really important. There are these expectations also on Germany, yeah, that it is playing a role, like it did in the past, also in leading Europe, in also this defense budget will change European security. And it's a huge discussion also in Nordic countries, but also in others. What does it mean for our security? Yeah, so and what does it mean for European security and integrated European security? And I think that's really a problem, that there is no leadership. There is, I think, still a policy of preventing conflicts, preventing a kind of criticism is my impression. I think it is really a big change that there is an understanding this is also about our security. I think that is the reaction of Scholz Zeitenwende speech, in my opinion. So this is about European security order, and this is also about German security. I think that's a big shift. Yeah, also this was not perceived in 2014 and the war which was then going on. I think there was already the shift in the Russian policy, in 2014. But we now recognized only this shift, because of the large-scale war. But I think the consequences which are taken in terms of supporting Ukraine and also the slow, like a salami tactic, you give a little bit and then you give more a little bit under pressure. I think it shows the lack of strategic deepness in the German decision-making circle and in the German discourse. I think we're discussing also a lot of things, but not these, what is the long term, what is our goal with Russia, where to go with Ukraine, and these kind of things. So Germany is not I think has not defined really its aims in a way. So accept that Ukraine should survive as a state. We need to increase European security, and on one point maybe we need to renegotiate European security. And I think that's a major absence is a problem for Europe. And I think Macron again tried to fill this gap in a way also with regard to the Eastern neighborhood. But how to say it? Other countries expect from Germany, that they fill this gap, and don't expect this big change will come from the French side. So on the 5 governors, I don't know. I think there are some conflicts also with regard mobilizing people for this war, especially in Siberian regions, and there are also pressure on the governors which partly just disagreed to do this, because they had also pressures from the societies. So I think here are some conflicts also inside of the system or with the regions and with the societies which are not so visible. We have these polls which show that most of 80% support the war and Putin, but we also know that this is not real. The support is much lower, and we see also a resistance to send people into this war. So the motivation is not very high, and I think this creates frictions in the system. And I also saw this reference to the anti-Hitler coalition. I found this interesting in the framework with the other things Putin have said. And I then thought, I don't know, it's just an interpretation, that could be a kind of an offer, for that's the countries with whom to negotiate. And this is the format also Russia likes, a kind of a Yalta format. This is what Putin always wants. So you can say it's maybe an opening for Yalta summit to negotiate about spheres of influence in Europe, I think. And then if you see what he said, what else said, I think that's all against what we can agree also in this setting, with the other countries. So I think it will be very difficult, but you could understand it as as a kind of an opening, but you could also just understand it also as a reference, yeah, to that there was this coalition, there was this cooperation, and Russia is a great power, yeah, which negotiates in this context, and if they want, I'm willing to talk and to negotiate about spheres of influence and security in Europe.
Many thanks, Stefan. I think it's now time to move on to András for his assessment.
Thank you very much, Henning, and good morning to everybody. Thank you for joining us already for the 12th time for our Ukraine briefings. Please allow me to share a map as usual, because it helps us navigate between the events, and particularly because right now there have been few rather dynamic changes in the front line. As usual, we are going to use the Institute for the Study of War maps. The most important development, positive developments, is of course in the Kharkiv front line. Ukrainian counterattack in and around Kharkiv has been surprisingly successful. Ukrainian forces have regained the territories marked blue here, and they are likely to keep pushing further east. They might very soon reach the Russian border, so push out Russian forces from this operational direction. According to open source information, Russia has only 3 more battalion tactical groups here, defending these small stretches of land, and even these 3 battalion tactical groups are quite much worn down, abgekämpft. So most likely Ukraine is going to restore its control over the border section. However, there are more than 10 additional Russian battalion tactical groups in the Belgorod Oblast on the other side of the border. So this Ukrainian advance is going to probably stop here. Why is it important? There are 2 reasons. First, through the territories regained, Kharkiv is now out of reach for Russian conventional artillery. So Russians are still able to attack Kharkiv by missiles and airstrikes, but for artillery, the city is out of range. So right now the burden on Kharkiv is fortunately decreasing. And second, Russia's ongoing offensive here in the Donbass largely relies on supply routes and ground lines of communication, which run relatively close to this Ukrainian advance at Kharkiv. So if Ukrainians manage to advance even further, they might endanger Russian ground lines of communication marked here. This would not stop the Russian offensive in the Donbass, but would force Russia to relocate some forces, probably from the Izium direction, to protect their supply routes. So the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kharkiv is the good news to watch. If we go to the Donbass front, here there are less good news. In the last week, Russians managed to take the city of Popasna, completely ruined already, but Popasna has been one of the fortified parts of the line of contact in the last 7 years. So by Popasna falling, it means Russians managed to break through that well-built Ukrainian defenses, which were along the line of contact in the last 7 years. Once Russians managed to advance further west from Popasna, they might very well endanger the Ukrainian units fighting here in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. Why? Because Popasna has been a fortified position, and the next properly fortified position is only back here, a bit east of Bakhmut. So between Popasna and Bakhmut, there are only just kind of improvised positions, but no proper fortifications, which could stop the Russian army. So once they manage to continue their advance towards Bakhmut, they will make an important step towards actually encircling Ukrainian units fighting here. Plus, they will be able to cut this crucial highway leading from Slavyansk to the occupied parts of the Donetsk region. So what's happening here in the Popasna direction is something important to watch. The second element is that Russians tried to cross the Siversky Donetsk River, which has been the line of contact for several weeks. Russians here managed to construct a pontoon bridge. They started a forceful crossing of the river, and that's when Ukrainian artillery hit them. So Ukrainian artillery, Ukraine reached spectacular success here, ruining the Russian river crossing effort. Russia suffered serious losses, but it doesn't mean that they would stop. This Ukrainian artillery attack against the Russian position, according to open sources, it indicates, and that's the good news, that Western heavy artillery systems, at least some Western heavy artillery systems, are not only already in Ukraine, but are also operating. So most probably this artillery strike was done by the M777 US heavy howitzers, employed very skillfully by Ukraine. So this is the good news. The bad news, there are signs that Russians are regrouping forces from the Izium direction, and instead of pushing further south at Izium, they would try to further improve their crossing of the Siversky Donets. And once they manage to cross the river and keep pushing south, combined with the Popasna effort going west, they might actually be able to encircle substantial Ukrainian forces fighting here in the east. So most probably the Russian operational objectives for the upcoming week would be to advance their river crossing effort and their Popasna effort, and thereby isolating, possibly encircling substantial Ukrainian forces fighting here in the east. If Russia manages to do that, Ukrainian leadership would be put in a very sensitive, very problematic situation, because then they would have to negotiate about the lives of their encircled soldiers. This is something we have already seen both during the Minsk I and the Minsk II agreements 8 and 7 years ago. So this is the thing to watch in the east. Mariupol is still holding. Contrary to Ukrainian reports from the 7th of May, now it seems to be that there are still some civilians stuck in the Azovstal factory, and a few hundred still fighting Ukrainian defenders. Probably nobody expected Azovstal to hold out as long as it does. Neither did I have to be honest. I mean, you remember from the previous briefings that I said many times that the end of Azovstal is close. Still, unfortunately, despite the heroic resistance, there seems to be no way to save the defenders of Azovstal unless a fresh Ukrainian effort bears fruits. Ukraine is trying something it hasn't tried so far, but now it's a new effort. They are offering Russian prisoners of war in exchange for the defenders of Azovstal. We will see how Russia reacts. I'm afraid that Russia would not accept this exchange, simply because Russia doesn't need alive heroes to be created from the defenders of Azovstal. I very much hope that I'm wrong here. When it comes to the other sections of the front line, in the southwest, so in the Mykolaiv direction, fighting is relatively steady. There seems to be no indication that Russians would be able to break through towards Mykolaiv and particularly endanger Odessa from land, at least from this direction. The main focus of the Russian efforts is clearly the Donbass. Here in the Kherson-Mykolaiv region, Russia is focusing on holding its own positions, not making much advance. As long as the battle for the Donbass is not yet over, this is unlikely to change. However, meanwhile, Russian missile and airstrikes keep continuously pounding Odessa, and defenders of Odessa are increasingly worried about potential sabotage or special operation actions from Transnistria. So Ukrainians are right now deploying and training additional territorial defense Teroborona units in the Odessa district, and will deploy them to the region bordering Transnistria in order to prevent any kind of sabotage operations. When it comes to the longer war effort and to the assessment that Putin might be preparing for a longer war, I fully agree with this assessment. And I think it is very important what Stefan said in the beginning, that the fact that Putin did not announce a general mobilization or partial mobilization, it does not mean that he would not announce it a few weeks from now. So we probably paid a bit too much attention to the 9th of May. The fact that no announcement was made on the 9th of May does not limit Putin's freedom of movement at all. And when Russia is preparing for a longer war, it also indicates that Russians assess that by attrition, they might be able to win over Ukraine. And let's be clear on that. despite optimistic and sometimes quite fierce Ukrainian declarations about achieving a complete victory and possibly regaining all the territories lost since 2014, Ukrainian army is suffering seriously from attrition, both in terms of trained soldiers and particularly from the shortage of fuel and ammunition. The shortage of ammunition is becoming critical, particularly for Ukraine's artillery units. So when Russia is opting for a longer war, when Russia is not taking risky moves anymore, but chooses for slow, very systematic advance, this is probably intended to bleed out the Ukrainian army and deplete the reserves and supplies of Ukraine's armed forces. So unfortunately here, I'm quite afraid that unless a substantial upgrade happens in Western military assistance to Ukraine, Ukraine might soon run out of some key materials necessary for conducting the for continuing the fight. It's not going to happen tomorrow, not going to happen next week, but this is something we are clearly heading towards. So we need to keep in mind the serious shortages of fuel and particularly ammunition in the side of Ukraine. So this would be my initial starting point. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to try to give an answer. Thank you.
There's one first question by Philip Hilsemantel, please.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a question both to Stefan and to András. Maybe first to András. What sort of systemic upgrade are you talking about? What do we need? And then also maybe an assessment. Now the season, obviously, you know, this territory is very seasonal in terms of warfare. We now seem to have gone through spring. How do you expect that to impact that sort of war of attrition that's going on? And then to Stefan, the question, we seem to, in the way that the Russians are waging a war of attrition on the ground, obviously the Western policy seems to be a containment that is very reminiscent of Afghanistan, and at least to my view. Annalena Baerbock yesterday said we will never again buy Russian oil, if I read it correctly. There was just the news just came in that the Finnish government has now opted officially for NATO membership. And so if the West keeps this sort of pressure on, how long do you expect Putin to hold out politically over the coming months and years? Or will there be pressure from within? Also bearing in mind that, you know, maybe the Ukrainians might be successful in creating a counter narrative that also puts pressure on other ex-Soviet states where they see that resistance is not futile. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And let's get Peter Linke also into the discussion. Your question, please.
This is a question for András Rácz. Would like to return to the parade on May the 9th. So in his speech, Putin again described military action in Ukraine as a preemptive measure. I just remember the press conference in early March where Russia claimed that it had found documents showing that Ukraine was planning an attack on Donbass. What are your latest ideas on the validity of these documents produced in early March by the Russian Defense Ministry?
Thank you very much. Maybe András first.
Thank you. I'd like to go in reverse order and answer first the question of Peter. I really love documents suddenly produced by the Russian Ministry of Defense. These documents were presented by the same Major General Igor Konashenkov, who is responsible for the international communication of the Russian Ministry of Defense. Konashenkov has long been around. It was Konashenkov who gave 2 official press conferences back in 2014 and 2015 about Malaysian airlines being shot down by the Ukrainians. Fun fact, the two press conferences given by Konashenkov contradicted actually even each other. So these sudden documents, these documents suddenly appearing and being presented by the Russian Minister of Defense, I would not give too much credibility to them. And also from the capabilities side, even when Russia started to push out this narrative that Ukraine was about to attack the Donbass yet back last year, there was no capability-related argument which would have supported the existence of such a Ukrainian intention. And the Ukrainian armed forces have not been in the status that they could have successfully win an offensive campaign against the Donbass, against the two separatist territories, particularly because the separatist regions were protected not only by those proxy armed forces, which were de facto two army corps of the Russian 8th Army, but also by the Russian Federation proper. So I just don't see how Ukraine could have militarily won any kind of such a campaign. So this Russian narrative that this was a preventive war and Ukraine was about to attack the Donbass, this I take simply as a not even too sophisticated piece of disinformation, nothing else. To the two questions of Philip, how to upgrade military support. In the short run, they need all the ammunition we can provide them with. All the ammunition remain, which is suitable for the weapon systems they use. So all the ammunition remaining from the post-Soviet stocks in Central and Eastern Europe, Ukraine would need all of it. In a bit longer term, with the arrival of Western heavy artillery systems, we need to make sure that Ukraine receives more heavy artillery, even possibly light artillery, and all the necessary ammunition for it. The US supplied heavy howitzers are done properly. From this perspective, US has provided around 90 howitzers and more than 200,000 pieces of ammunition. Why is it important? An average life expectancy of a barrel of a howitzer is about 2,000 shots. Thereafter, you have to exchange the barrel because it just gets burned down. So the US provided enough ammunition for these howitzers to be used until the very last moment. This is how we shall supply weapons and ammunition to Ukraine. Otherwise, they will run critically short of ammunition. To the question of seasonality of warfare, yes, it indeed plays a role. In the last week, we saw relatively few Russian air operations because the weather was bad. A lot of rains, cloudy weather, and when there are clouds force Russian Air Force to come down to low altitude when they are more vulnerable to Ukraine's shoulder-fired air defense missiles. Bad news, weather is about to clear up, so we will see more intensive operations of Russia's air forces. And the rains also, of course, soften the soil, soften the ground. So the relatively not too dynamic operations we've seen in the last week were also due to the weather. As spring is slowly turning into summer, summers in eastern Ukraine are usually very warm, dry, with, of course, long daylight periods. So in terms of seasonality, I expect ground fighting and airstrikes to become a lot more intensive than what we have seen in the last weeks. In the chat, we have a question from Mikhail Bushuyev about the prognosis of possible war scenarios. In the short run, I do not see that the war would end anytime soon unless something really unexpected happens. So my forecast here is that a long attrition war, and this attrition war may very well end in Ukraine losing not only Donetsk and Luhansk regions, but unfortunately also large parts of Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. At the moment, as long as Russia does not order general or partial mobilization, I do not see that Russian army would be able to advance more than the Kherson region, simply because they are running out of soldiers. If there will be a Russian partial mobilization or particularly general mobilization, that would change the calculus, not immediately, but in the medium and long run for sure. So this is my short forecast. One more thing to that. It's important to nail down, Ukraine has already won from the perspective that whichever way the war ends, Ukraine will exist as a sovereign state. So contrary to the original Russian objectives to take out the Ukrainian leadership and install a puppet government, this scenario is out. So whichever way the war ends, Ukraine will keep existing as a sovereign state in Europe. Weakened, possibly bled out, quite likely suffering serious territorial losses, but Ukraine will survive. This is already a victory in itself. So this is my short assessment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, András. Stefan, and maybe we'll also pick up on the sort of the situation in Finland and Sweden. And I mean, this is if we talk about a longer war, the sort of the membership of these two countries in NATO is a given and or looks very likely now, and sort of the sort of first steps NATO is going to take to get into a position to deal with a long war are also sort of already sort of taking shape. Maybe you can mention some of your impressions from your travels as well.
I wanted to add also several things, and I think what András, the last thing he said, I think that's why it's also important that Ukraine needs a European perspective, also a perspective, a development perspective, a rebuilding perspective, and also to strengthen Ukraine as a state. And I think that's very crucial that this accession process starts, how it will then look like and how long it will go. It should be serious, definitely. That needs to be discussed. But I think that's very important. I just want to add another military aspect. We had the Rammstein meeting, and I think that was the big shift also in the Western policy. I just wanted to remind on this. So we are running out of Soviet weapons. I think the US was really looking around the world where they can find the US Soviet weapons, and there are not anymore, not available at least. From those countries who still have, they are rather partners of Russia, and they will not supply. So I think that's really a shift to supply now finally with Western weapons. And I also learned yesterday that Ukrainians are trained on German territory since 2-3 years by the US, and since 2 days also by the German army. So this training has already started a couple of weeks ago by the US, and it's now also done by the German army. And I think that will change also the war in a way. But we also understand that this is a window for Russia now, where there is this shortage of weapons, ammunition, that they have to gain as much as possible within the next 2 or 3 weeks before the Western weapons are coming and the trained soldiers are going back. And I think this is also what we see at the moment, to destroy supply routes systematically, that it is getting more difficult to supply the Ukrainian army also in the east. So this systematic bombardment of infrastructure. There was a question on interaction with civil society, how we should increase interaction with Russian civil society. It was also in the chat. I think we should concentrate on the diaspora very much. I think we cannot so much reach out to Russians in Russia, but we should also not close every door. I think that's in my opinion not a right policy. I think we need also to keep, at least as it is possible, some contacts. And I think really more systematically working with a Russian diaspora, Russian immigrants who left Russia now also, on a different perspective for Russia, beyond Putin, beyond this kind of regime. I think, and that's very, very important also to do this systematically and with a middle and long-term approach. So to the questions, the pressure from inside within the next years, I think the economic, as we see, the economic costs are high, but still Russia is selling oil and gas. It has quite good income also. The prices have been growing, especially for gas. For oil, they cannot sell it to maybe to the market price, but the price is really high. So I think there is quite an income also for the Russian budget. The ruble is stabilized. So I think the impact in short term is not so strong. It will be much stronger in middle and long term, especially in the industrial sector, technology sanctions. For most of the Russian products, also in the military industrial complex, they need Western components, and they're running out of these components. They even have shortages also in producing weapons and also other technical equipments. And I think that will really have an impact, and also less opportunities to travel. Economic crisis definitely will come. So I think pressure will grow on the society, but I don't see at the moment that there will be really a regime change and where it should come from. I don't see the people who would do this, and I think there will be always enough money for the security forces also, in the budget. So we don't know what happens in middle and long term, but in short term, I don't expect this change. Middle and long term, pressure will be strong. Economic pressure will be really strong. Russia is in a different, so the economy will completely change with these sanctions. So on these counter narratives by Ukraine, other post-Soviet countries, for me, it's definitely the disintegration of the post-Soviet space will be accelerated with this war. I think Russia has now alienated everybody, and everybody is afraid of a Russian attack, in the post-Soviet space. Even the Kazakhs prepare at least somehow their military, and the threat perception also from Russia is completely different. But they are all very careful. Or not all, but many of them are very careful in really openly support Ukraine. You can see it in Georgia, but partly also in Moldova, very carefully, in not supporting sanctions and this narrative. So I think everybody's afraid of Russia, but I think in middle and long term, the disintegration will go on. Every country will look for alternative security guarantees. And there will other players coming in, not only EU or NATO, but China, Turkey, others who challenge also Russia in this sphere of influence. But I think, or in this post-Soviet space, But again, this is for me a middle and long-term perspective. I think it's Russia is at the moment seen as mainly as a security threat, and countries are very careful. On Finland and Sweden, so we were in Norway and in Sweden, and maybe András can also add something. I think for me a main takeaway is this is really a major security shift since the end of World War II, since 1945, for Northern Europe and also for Europe. That two Nordic countries are joining, if they will do it, and it's very likely, this is at least the feedback we got, will join NATO. I think that will completely change, this will change NATO. It will double the border of NATO with Russia. It will also raise a Russian reaction in the north. And it will even more integrate these two countries within NATO and European security. And I think we still don't realize how big this change is and how this change will also be perceived from the Russian side, which until now has not so much invested in the modernization of its military forces in the north. But I think this is very likely now to come if this happens. And then it's really the whole question, the big questions are, will there be US or other NATO troops on Finnish territory? What does this mean also in the relations with Russia? How to integrate also the German 100 billion euros spending with the changing Nordic NATO integration. I think that's something to discuss, I think, because also Germany will become, with its spending, a major player in European security, only when it buys weapons. And I think this kind of integration with Nordic security needs to be developed and discussed. I think it's very important. And I think we have no attention, or we have very limited attention to this, but it's also changing the Nordic balance, in a way that Norway was the key partner for the US in the north, and it's now maybe more sidelined in a way that Sweden, but also Finland are becoming also important partners for NATO and the US. So it will also shift the balance between the countries with regard to transatlantic relations. I don't think it will change them fundamentally, but it's just more linkages also, with the US. And I think that will have also a dynamic in itself. So András, I don't know if you want to add some. So I just made some key points also because we're running out of time. Yeah.
Nothing to add. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think with that, and given that we are 3 minutes over time, I'd like to thank our panelists, András Rácz, Stefan Meister, also Liana Fix earlier. Thank you all for joining us again this morning, and I hope to see you soon at the next event.